There is a garden, there is a city, and there's a kingdom of God. And it is beautiful, and he is bringing it right now into our midst.
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth.
And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying,
"Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them.
They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God.
He will wipe every tear from their eyes.
There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain.
For the old order of things has passed away.
He who was seated on the throne said,
I am making everything new."
Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life.
On each side of the river stood the tree of life.
And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations.
No longer will there be any curse.
January 18, 1989. Pastor Ron Piper died and went to heaven. He was driving his Ford Escort on his way to church. It was a very foggy day, and an 18-wheeler coming right at him jumped the line and crashed and crushed his car and crushed Pastor Piper. By the time the medic crews got there on site to this multi-car accident pileup, they checked him and no pulse. He was obviously beyond any help. They rushed on to help other less injured people. One of the staff colleagues of Ron Piper was driving by, and he saw that what had happened, and so he gets out of his car and he rushes over to where his pastor is, and there he is, lifeless. And his friend starts praying and starts singing, "What a friend we have in Jesus." And all of a sudden, dead Pastor Piper starts singing along. Now, when the medics realized that he was still alive, they rushed back to give whatever help they could. And 34 surgeries later, many years later, he wrote a book called 90 Minutes in Heaven, where he described what he had experienced in heaven during that time when he was not alive on earth. It became a bestseller. They actually turned it into a movie. Hey, we are in our final week of our Revelation series, and I hope you guys have found it helpful and beneficial as we just tried to give you some of the main themes about this amazing book. And what we have is our final devotional study, and what you're going to wind up doing is we're going to walk through the last few chapters. I'm going to explain those chapters today, and so therefore when you read them, you're going to enjoy them and understand them even more. And then what we also did is we decided to give like a bullet point summary of everything we have covered in this whole series. You're going to find this a really, really useful wrap-up and summary. Please pick up a copy of that before you leave. Man, fascination with heaven. The Apostle Paul said that the eye hasn't seen, the ear has not heard, and the mind can never imagine what God has in store for those who love him. And he's referring to eternity, he's referring to heaven. That was in 1 Corinthians. And 2 Corinthians, as he's following up his letter, he winds up talking to the Corinthians about a man. Paul knew a man. Now, by the way, the man Paul is referring to is himself. It's just that Paul is just trying to kind of play down his image. He doesn't want to be some kind of super impressive person. And so he kind of uses a euphemism, a man I knew. And it was Paul himself who was caught up into what he calls the third heaven. He was caught up into paradise, and he saw things that were simply inexpressible. He was not allowed to report what he had seen in heaven. A little girl was drawing a picture, and her mother said, "Hey, honey, what are you drawing?" And the little girl says, I'm drawing a picture of heaven." "Oh, sweetie, nobody knows what heaven looks like." "They will when I'm done drawing." Yeah, you know, we just want to know. There's this fascination and longing to know what heaven is like. You know, studies show that still 70% of Americans believe in heaven. Now, by the way, that number is decreasing over the last 20 years. Fewer people believe in heaven than ever before. And that's kind of understandable in our secular post-Christian culture, but still 70% of people do. However, when you read what they believe about heaven, man, their answers and descriptions are all over the place, revealing a lot of confusion about heaven. You know, we want to know what heaven is like. And even though Paul said he was not allowed to describe what heaven is like, it didn't stop people from wondering what he saw. And so in the 4th century, an anonymous Christian wrote the Apocalypse of Paul, and it describes what Paul saw in the first heaven and the second heaven and the third heaven and paradise. And in the 4th century, it actually became a best-selling book in the 4th century. It was translated into almost every European language there was at that time. That's how popular it was. That's how much people wanted to know what heaven was like. Centuries later, in the 12th century, there was a knight named Tondale, and he falls in battle, and he's injured, and he goes into a coma. And while he's in this coma, an angel takes him on this grand tour of heaven. And eventually, when he comes out of his coma, he writes about what he saw. It's called the Vision of Tondale, and it also became a bestseller for centuries. And here's what's fascinating. The vision that he saw was written in such beautiful way that people would actually read the book just for the sheer pleasure of reading it, not as much for spiritual edification. They just loved reading how he had described heaven. And we're so fascinated in heaven, which is why 90 Minutes in Heaven by Don Piper was such a bestseller. So like Mitch Albom's book, the 5 people you meet in heaven, he was trying to help people understand what it might be like. It's Bruce Springsteen's After 9/11, The Rising album that he put together. I mean, it's his most spiritual album that he's done. And it's filled with ideas and thoughts about what heaven might be like because so many people, I've lost so many. And it's just a beautiful album. Becky and I went to hear Springsteen in concert up there in the Meadowlands. And as he's singing the music from The Rising, I think he did the entire album. It's like you could just see all these people from Jersey and from New York. They're just like worshiping. They're holding up it was like an amazing experience because they're trying to connect with this thing called heaven and all the grief and pain that they had having lost so many people. It's what I think why Paul Young's book and movie The Shack was so popular. I mean, 10 million people bought copies of that. Millions more read the copy of their friends as he's just helping understand a little bit about what heaven might be like. Mac Phillips has suffered horrific loss. He's angry at God. And he gets a chance to see what heaven might be like. And then that beautiful movie, Heaven is for Real. It just moves so many people. I mean, we just want to know what heaven is like, but yet nobody knows what heaven is like. And John is writing, and he says, hey, even though nobody knows what heaven is like, they will when I'm done. And so chapter 21 and 22 are what heaven is like. By the way, remember many times I've said through the series that Revelation doesn't really tell us anything new, but what it does tell us is everything old in these fresh, creative ways. Well, that is true until we get to chapter 21 and 22. And now it's actually kind of new. John in chapter 21 and 22 tells us more about heaven than the entire rest of the Bible put together. If we literally took 21 and 22 out of the Bible, there would be so many things about heaven that we just would not know. That's how powerful and fresh John's description is. In most of Revelation, he's talking about the visions of what he saw happening on earth. But then we come to chapter 19, verse 11, and John says, I saw heaven standing open, and he begins to reveal to us what he saw. And this week, as you're going through the devotional, you'll be able to read that. But let me walk you through some of the things that John saw. We're just going to kind of walk through 21 and 22. Now, here's the very first thing he saw, and that it's maybe heaven isn't even the right word. Heaven sounds a little bit too disembodied. It almost sounds like we're spirits and souls and angels just kind of floating around out there. John didn't see that. He saw, listen, verse 1, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. He goes on and talks about the city that's coming down from heaven to earth. And then verse 5, he who was seated on the throne said, I am making all things new. Don't we all know that right now here on earth, it's not the way it's supposed to be? I mean, it's not. Over the years, Living Word has used different words. We used to use the word broken. So many things are broken. And then we settled on the word messy because that's just how people experience life. It's just very, very messy. Hard, difficult things happen to most of us throughout our lives. And for some of us, some really horrible, tragic things happen. And we just know it's not meant to be this way. And we're not meant to experience the things that we experience. We're not meant to go through the sadness and the mourning and the grief and the anger and the rage and all. It's just not supposed to be that way. And so John begins to describe this new creations and this new earth the way it's meant to be. And when most people think of heaven, at some point, they're going to have in their description or their understanding, heaven is this place of perfection. It's just perfect. There's nothing wrong in heaven. Somehow you're going to always get the language of perfect being woven in there. This new creation is simply perfect. I don't know of anybody who has described what the new creation John is talking about, what it might be like better than a person named C.S. Lewis. Man, there's a couple of C.S. Lewis's books where, he just has sat with Revelation 21 and 22 and allowed his artistic imagination to run and try to say, how can I communicate what this new creation might be like? And so, of course, many of you know about Narnia, the seven books about Narnia, where Narnia is a sort of magical, wonderful, mysterious place where it's ruled by Aslan, the king, who is really an image of Jesus. And children go to Narnia to have adventures where they learn about love and mercy and forgiveness and reconciliation. They learn about courage and faith, and they learn about trusting in Aslan. Narnia is just this wonderful place, but eventually Narnia also is not the way it's supposed to be, and evil increasingly comes to Narnia, and Narnia in the end is destroyed, and the children and others who have trusted in Aslan, they have moved into this new world, and they're trying to figure out where exactly are we? And we're only beginning to see where we were, and they realize, well, Narnia isn't dead. This is Narnia, but how can it be? We saw Narnia die. We saw the sun extinguished. Yes, said Eustace, and it's so different. Well, listen, the eagle is right. Peter, when Aslan said you could never go back to Narnia, he meant the Narnia that you were used to, but that's not the real Narnia. That was just a beginning and an end. It was a shadow or a copy of the real Narnia. All of the old Narnia that mattered, all of the dear creatures, they've been drawn into the real Narnia through the door. And of course, this is as different. This Narnia is as different from the old as waking up is different from a dream, as the real thing is from a shadow. Now, it's hard to explain how this new Narnia was different, but listen to this. It's like the new one was a deeper country. Every rock and flower and blade of grass looked as if it meant more. I can't describe it any better than that. If you ever get there, you will know what I mean. And the children, they all said, we've come home at last. This is the real country. We've always belonged here. This is the land we've been looking for our whole lives. And the only reason we love the old Narnia is sometimes the old Narnia looked a little bit like the real Narnia. It's just this magnificent description. I read the last couple of chapters of this book every year, and sometimes several times a year. Man, I think one of the reasons we no longer are that interested in this new creation, this new earth, this new heavens, is because we just kind of have gotten kind of comfortable with life here. We're more interested in being comfortable and enjoyable right here. And so we sort of forget about our real home because we're just settled down in here. And it's only when life starts to get harder do we start to think more about this new creation called heaven. That's why after 9/11, interest in heaven spiked. Because we were going through suffering. We didn't know what to do with it. We had these longings. That's why for the black slave experience in America before and during the Civil War, so much of the black spirituality was a longing for heaven, a longing for a better home, a longing for freedom, because they knew they weren't going to get anything better on earth. And so they had a longing for heaven, and it's seen in their music, swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Just this longing for heaven because life on earth was not so good. During the Civil War, interest in heaven spiked. Because the Civil War, death was common and grief was the new norm for everybody. Everybody lost somebody. Sons died, husbands died, fathers died, brothers died. Every family was touched by grief. It was the new norm. And destruction was rampant. And so people began to long for a better place. And so a woman named Elizabeth Phelps, who had lost her brother, and was just stricken with grief about it. She has this vision where an angel takes her to heaven, and she wrote a book called Gates Ajar. Gates Ajar, you can kind of peer into heaven, and she just describes heaven as this perfect place. It's a wonderful description where it's like the mountains are in the sunset, and the forest, the winds are rustling the leaves, and friends and family sit around firesides for a conversation, and the meals are delicious, and music is everywhere, and it's just this perfect place. By the way, it became the number 3 bestseller in the United States from the time of the Civil War to right up about 1900. The only 2 books that sold more were Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Bible. That's how interested people were in heaven, because that's what happens when time gets harder. We start to long for this new creation, this new heavens and this new earth that John describes. Number 2, heaven is this place where we are with God. We read in verse 3, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them, and he will be their God. When we long for heaven, and we do long for heaven, I think what we're really longing for, and John has captured it, we're longing for God because we miss God. And heaven is a place where we will no longer miss God. We will be with God and he will be with us. I've always been fascinated by atheist Julian Barnes who says, I don't believe in God, but I sure do miss him. Well, that's intriguing to me. Lisa Miller, she is an award-winning journalist for religion. She researched for years and wrote a very magnificent book on heaven. And toward the end of the book, actually, I think it's in the afterwards, she winds up describing all that she has written about, all she's learned. She says, but I don't believe. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in life after death. I don't believe in heaven. I don't believe I'm going to be reunited with my family and friends. I just don't believe. I want to believe, and I need the hope of that. But because I don't believe, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hope in the idea of heaven. Now think about how sad that is. I don't believe there's a real thing called heaven, but so the best I can do is I can hold on to the false idea that there is, and that's going to give me hope. It's like, how sad. We're meant to have this hope of heaven because the hope of heaven is the longing to be with God. Man, as you move through the New Testament, you see this wonderful progression of intimacy with God. We start out, we're called disciples. Disciples are servants and followers with Jesus. But very quickly, Jesus, that's not nearly good enough. I call you my friends. And as we progress, Jesus, but that's not nearly good enough. You're my sisters and brothers. We're family together. And now by the time we get to the book of Revelation, John has seized on one of the most powerful images he can find of intimacy, and that is we are the bride of Jesus. We are the bride of Jesus. That language is used over and over in chapter 21, 22. We are the bride. There's nothing more intimate. Oh, and then there's one more image he uses about seeing the face of God. Moms in particular, but moms and dads, these newborn babies, and when you're holding them, they just look into your face. They can't stop looking at your face. And it's like as you're looking at the face of the baby and the babies look at you, there's this amazing intimacy. No hindrances, no barriers, no restrictions. And we have wanted to see the face of God ever since we were kicked out of the garden. And we've been told nobody can see the face of God and live. But John says, no, now in this new creation, that's all been reversed. Now we will see him face to face. And his name will be written on our foreheads. It's just amazing descriptions of intimacy. That's what we long for. And that's what the new creation will be forever and ever, this amazing intimacy with God. I think that's why so many people loved The Shack. I did. Oh yeah, there were a couple little theological issues, and there were a couple, liberties he took, but here, Mac Phillips has suffered such horrible evil, and it's broken him. And he's become angry at God. He used to believe in God, but he stopped believing in God because how can I believe in God when something so evil has happened? And The Shack is about God reaching out and beginning this conversation of friendship and love and compassion and mercy. And we're all caught up because that's what we're all longing for. And that's what heaven is going to be forever and ever. And then heaven is a place where there's no more evil. Yeah, we do know it's not the way it's supposed to be. Evil everywhere. John made that really clear in chapters 1 through 19. Evil is everywhere. And we've experienced evil everywhere. And because evil is everywhere, because hard times are everywhere, we've experienced, hurt and sadness and grief and mourning and lament and also anger and rage and worry and fear and depression. Becky just recently shared a news article just as up to date as it gets. It says right now, 2 out of 5 adults in America are dealing with depression and anxiety. It's not the way it's supposed to be. And surprising is the adult population that has more anxiety and depression than any other is young adults, 18 to 29. 57% of them say they are dealing with anxiety and depression. It's not the way it's supposed to be. 2020 was not the way it's supposed to be, right? So therefore, God has a word. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order has passed away. And again, I'm making all things new. The new creation there's no more sadness, only gladness. We read a little bit later, nothing impure can enter this new creation. There's no badness, there's only goodness. In chapter 22, we read, the curse is ended. You remember way back in the garden, chapters 1 and chapter 2, God created the creation originally, and it said, oh, it's so good, over and over, it's good, oh, it's so very, very good, and it was blessed. Everything was blessed until chapter 3, when sin wrecked our world, and when we made the decision to be the original rebels against God and set ourselves up as God in his place, and from that point on, everything was now called cursed. In chapter 3, for the first time, we read the word cursed. To be cursed means, there's afflictions, there's troubles, there's woes, there's problems, there's difficulties, there's ruin, there's evil everywhere. That's what life has been like. There's a curse upon humanity, but not in the new creations. The curse is no more. There's no more evil. And that's why our hearts long for this place called heaven, because right now it's the way it's supposed to be, and we're not the way we're supposed to be, and we want it to be the way it was meant to be originally. And then John talks about the immensity of it all. Actually, most of chapter 21, he's just trying to say, heaven is bigger. Heaven is better. Heaven is beautifuler. More beautiful. Bigger, better, more beautiful than you could ever possibly imagine. And he spends like 10 or 12 verses just talking about how big and beautiful it is. Heaven is immense. It's huge, it's vast, it's gigantic, it's enormous, it's expansive. Weeks ago, I don't even remember what message it was, I just made reference to that new city that is coming down, and because John loves numbers and he uses these amazing numbers, and it's 1,400 miles this way, and it's 1,400 miles this way, and it's 1,400 miles high, and by the time he's done, he's describing a city that is bigger than the entire Roman Empire. If we would situate it on a North American map, it would fill up, most of North America. That's how big this city is, and it's a cube. It's just 1 billion miles big. Expansive in space. And that's just the city. When you get outside the city, then you have mountains and forests and beaches and oceans just stretching on forever for you and I to explore and enjoy forevermore. It's just big. It's immense in size. And it's immense in beauty. Now, I know a bunch of you have been overseas on missions trips, and I've been to a lot of different countries, and I've walked through a lot of third world cities, and there's always a couple places that are impressive and beautiful, but you start to kind of dig around a little bit and snoop around a little bit, and the next thing you know, it's like, oh boy, it's really dirty, and this isn't so nice, and this is in disrepair, and just think back to first century cities. Here's what they didn't have. They didn't have waste management stopping by twice a week to pick up your garbage. And they didn't have running water, and they didn't have plumbing, and they didn't have sewage. Well, they did. It was right there in the streets. And so first century cities, for the most part, they were dirty, filthy, disgusting, ruined, disrepair places. And for people who are living in cities like that, John is describing a city called this New Jerusalem. And we build out of wood and drywall, bricks and mortar. You know what they build out of? You know what they build the city out of in heaven? Jewels, gems. And so he lists the 12 most precious gems of the ancient world. He said, that's what they build this new city out of. It's beautiful. And the streets. We built our streets out of asphalt. By the way, it was a rough winter, wasn't it? Snowplows came and plowed up the snow, and they some of the asphalt. How many of you went rushing, there's a chunk of asphalt, and you picked up that chunk of asphalt, and you took it inside and put it someplace for safekeeping? Well, why not? Well, because it's worthless, right? That's what you pave streets with, worthless stuff. What do they pave streets with in heaven? Well, they pave streets with worthless stuff. The most common stuff there is. What is that? Gold. John is just trying to make a point. Heaven is bigger and better and more beautiful than you can imagine. It is just immense in beauty. But here's what heaven is really immense at. Heaven. Man, he says the glory of God just radiates through heaven. We don't need the sun, we don't need the moon, we don't need any of the lights, because the glory of God is the light of the new creation, and Jesus is the lamp. That's all we need. Once again, John is just soaking in these Old Testament ideas. God said, nobody can see my glory and live. Moses wanted to see the glory of God, and God said, no, you can't, Moses. I love you too much. If you saw my glory, you'd die right away. Isaiah the prophet has a vision, kind of a mediating thing where he sees God seated on the throne, and the vision is so glorious. Isaiah just falls flat on his face. He's like dead. He has to be revived and forgiven because God's face and glory is so much. Every now and then, here on earth, we get a glimpse of the glory of God. It's rare, but it happens. Every now and then it happens here, doesn't it? But it's rare. And when it does happen, it's like it's dimmed down as low as it can go so we can survive. But not in heaven. There's no dimming down of glory. Just let it shine. Crank the glory meter up to the full and let it shine. I mean, the glory of God, the face of God, the beauty of God, the majesty of God, the splendor of God, it's glory beyond imagining. And you say, Pastor Brian, what are you talking about? I say, I don't know. It's above my pay grade, this thing called the glory. It's above my pay grade. It's above this feeble intellect to understand. Frankly, it was above John's. John didn't really try to explain. He just described it. But I tell you what, I can hardly wait to get there to find out what it means. How about you? Glory everywhere, all of the time. Heaven is just immense in size and beauty and glory. And heaven is this place of life. Chapter 22, the angels show me the river of the water of life. That's clear as crystal flowing from the throne of God. It's flowing right down the middle of the great street of the city. And on either side of the river stood these trees of life. Once again, John takes us right back to the garden of Genesis 1 and 2. There's these 4 streams, rivers flowing together in the garden, just describing life. And there's a tree of knowledge of good and evil, and there's the tree of life. Now, by the way, do you notice that there's no longer any tree of knowledge of good and evil in heaven because there's no longer any evil, and we all now know knowledge. So now there's 2 trees of life in heaven. We're made for life. And John, I know, is reflecting back on what he said about Jesus, our life, in the Gospels. Chapter 1, in him was life. Chapter 10, verse 10, John says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. I came that you might have real and better, more and eternal life than you ever dreamed of. In John chapter 14 next week, which is all about the resurrection. And if today is about heaven, the place, next week is about heaven, the kind of people that are going to be there. And there's a certain kind of people that are called resurrected people. I'm going to try and tell you as best I can what it means to be a resurrected person. But Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life, and whoever believes in me will never die. And if you believe in me, even though you die, you don't really die, you live forever. Oh, and by the way, because you're going to live forever, I'm going back to my father's mansion. I'm going to prepare a room for you. And by the time we get to the Revelation, John's cluing, saying, hey, it's not just a room, and it's not just a house. It's not just a garden. It's not just paradise. It's a city full of gardens. It's a spacious, beautiful, amazing place where every nook and cranny of the new creation is flooded with the life of Jesus. In him we live and move and have our being. He sustains the entire universe by his life, by his love, by his power, and therefore somehow creation is going to be more alive than it's ever been. I mean, right now we just experience creation as kind of dead. But in heaven, creation is alive with the life of Jesus. And we get to explore and enjoy it forever and ever. Just life is what the new creation is all about. Here's the last thing. All together, we are finally, truly, all together the way we were meant to be. First family and friends, who have known and loved Jesus. Even family and friends who know and love Jesus, we don't always get along, do we? We've had a lot of broken families. We have a lot of broken friendships. 2020 broke families more. 2020 broke friendships more. We're just, disunited, angry, frustrated, irritated, judgmental, suspicious, critical, complaining. I mean, more than we've ever been. But in heaven, we're finally together the way we're meant to be, because you see, all the stuff I just described, that's the evil that's been eradicated. You can't take any of that with you. Man, I'm sorry if you like to complain, but you can't complain in heaven. I'm sorry. I don't want to say get it out now, because I don't want you to do that either. We're finally together in deep love and joy and warmth and peace with one another. But it's not just family and friends. Everybody's all together. Remember those nations and tribes and peoples and tongues and languages that John has been talking about all through the book of Revelation? Remember that? Well, we read in chapter 22 that the nations are there. They're finally together. The nations are bringing their glory in. They're finally together with the God that they've loved and served and worshiped. And God is their God. And so now the nations are together. Remember those trees of life? On those trees of life are leaves, and the leaves are for the healing of the nations, because never have we been more divided at so many levels. But in heaven, we will finally be together the way we are meant to be together. I mean, heaven is just this amazing place. The new creation, just spectacular beyond our imagining. And even with John saying, oh, you're going to know what it's like when I'm done writing, we're just getting the teases, the hints of what it's going to be like. No wonder Teresa of Avila, that's in Spain, in the 1500s, she said, okay, think about this. Even for somebody who has the worst life on earth imaginable, by the time you get to heaven and you look back on that worst life unimaginable, from the vantage point of heaven, your life, you will now understand it as nothing more than one inconvenient night at a cheap motel. And so therefore, let me read the final words from the last battle as Lewis just tries to help you understand heaven forevermore. And as he, Aslan, spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion. By the way, now you know what Aslan's starting to look like to the children. But the things that began to happen afterwards were so great and beautiful, I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of the story, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. And all their life in this world and all the adventures they had in Narnia, they were only the cover and the title page of the great story, which goes on forever, and in which every chapter is better than the one before. And so that's why John finishes his revelation with the appeal, with the invitation. Oh man, don't miss out on heaven. Don't miss out on the new creation. Don't miss out on Jesus, who is life. And he just talks about, receive the gift of this living water named Jesus. Hey, right now, would you bow your heads with the word of prayer? And I don't want any of you here to miss out on Jesus. I don't want any of you to miss out on this amazing, beautiful new creation. And so maybe you've not had that relationship with Jesus. The words I'm going to say, the words really don't matter, but the heart matters. Just say, Jesus, I'm tired of missing out. I'm tired of missing you. I want you, Jesus, to be my friend, to be my Savior, to be my life. And I bow right now, Jesus, before you as my King. And I want to worship you. I want to come together with all the people here and just love you and worship you and serve you. Let's just continue with the last couple songs to finish up our series and finish up worshiping our amazing Jesus Christ.